The red dust of the panhandle was a promise and a curse. It rose from the plains in a constant, fine mist, settling on every surface, tinting the very air with a coppery haze. For Evelyn Hart, it was the grit she tasted in her water and the film she wiped from the tins of beans and sacks of flour at the end of each day. At 20 years old, she knew the moods of this land better than she knew the faces of the parents she barely remembered. She understood the whine of a coming norther, the dry crackle of the air before a dust storm, and the profound, soul-shrinking silence of the prairie at midnight. Her world was the small, weather-beaten supply post on the goodnight-loving trail, a place that smelled of oiled leather, coffee grounds, and the sharp tang of the blacksmith's forge next door. Drovers, soldiers, and settlers passed through like the migrating herds, their faces etched with the same harsh lines as the landscape. They paid for their goods, sometimes offered a tired pleasantry, and moved on. Leaving Evelyn in the quiet eddy of their wake, she worked for her keep, a debt of gratitude to her Aunt Miriam, a woman whose kindness was as boundless as her spine was soft. That afternoon, the wind had teeth. It whipped Evelyn's braid against her cheek as she secured a loose shutter, the sharp cracks of the wood echoing the unease coiling in her gut. Miriam had been wringing her hands all morning, her gaze darting toward the dusty track that served as a road. The source of her anxiety soon arrived in a clatter of hooves and the squeak of a carriage that needed grease. Ephraim Pike stepped down, a man whose bulk was all soft flesh and hard angles. He wore a waistcoat too tight for his belly and a smile that never reached his small, calculating eyes. Behind him lingered Clyde Weller, a man whittled down to little more than bone and malice, his hand resting perpetually near the pistol on his hip. Pike tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of politeness. "Miriam, my dear, and the lovely Evelyn. A fine, blustery day to conduct business, is it not?" Miriam smoothed her apron, her hands trembling. "Mr. Pike, I was not expecting you until the end of the month." "Circumstances change, as they so often do out here," Pike said, his eyes sweeping over the meager contents of the supply post. He ran a finger along a dusty shelf, then inspected the tip as if it had been soiled. The ledger. "Miriam, it tells a sorry tale, a very sorry tale indeed." Evelyn stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of her aunt. "We will have the money. The cavalry payroll is due through next week. There will be plenty of business then." Pike's smile widened, showing teeth stained with tobacco. "Ah, youthful optimism, a charming, if unprofitable, commodity. Your debt, my dear ladies, has become a matter of some urgency. Certain associates of mine are growing impatient. They require security, an assurance." His gaze fell fully on Evelyn, and it was not the appreciative glance of a man admiring a woman. It was the look of a rancher assessing livestock. A cold knot formed in Evelyn's stomach. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of men in the saloon. But Pike's was different. It held the weight of ownership. "I have a proposition," Pike continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr, "a way to settle this affair to everyone's satisfaction. You see, my freight lines have been troubled. Unfortunate misunderstandings with our Comanche neighbors to the south. It is bad for business. It makes my associates nervous." He paused, letting the silence hang in the dusty air. From outside, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was the only sound. "Peace is a valuable thing, Miriam, and I have found a way to purchase it. A personal treaty, you might say. A bond of trust." He gestured toward the road. Another rider had arrived, his approach as silent as the dust settling. He was Comanche, his face a sculpture of calm dignity, his long black hair held back by a simple leather band. He sat astride his pony with an easy grace that made him seem a part of the animal. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than Evelyn, yet his eyes held a stillness that spoke of a much older soul. "This is Tahai," Pike announced, as if presenting a prized horse. He is a man of considerable influence among his people. He understands the value of stable trade relations. We have come to an arrangement, a marriage of interests. You could call it. Miriam gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A marriage. To seal our accord, Pike said smoothly. A sign of good faith. He will take a wife from our community, and in return, my wagons will pass unmolested. It is a simple, elegant solution. His gaze locked onto Evelyn again, cold and final. He will take Evelyn. The world tilted. The dust in the air seemed to thicken, choking her. Evelyn stared at the Comanche rider. Tahay's expression was unreadable. He did not look at her with lust or even interest. He simply watched, his dark eyes missing nothing. This was not about him or her. This was a transaction, and she was the currency. No, Evelyn said, her voice a raw whisper. Absolutely not. The debt is considerable, Pike reminded Miriam, his tone hardening. And my patience is not this post, this roof over your head. It all belongs to the ledger. You can clear the slate today, Miriam, or you can be on the trail with nothing but the clothes on your back by sundown. Tears streamed down Miriam's face. She looked from Pike's cruel smirk to Evelyn's horrified expression, her will crumbling like sun-baked mud. Evelyn, please, we have nowhere else to go. He is a savage, Evelyn hissed, the words she had been taught since childhood rising like bile in her throat. For the first time, Tahay spoke. His voice was low and steady, with none of the guttural cadence the dime novels described. I am a man, and this is a matter of honor, not of passion. He directed his words to Pike, but his eyes were on Evelyn. The agreement is for protection. Nothing more is required. He was promising her safety, even within the confines of this monstrous bargain. It was a detail Pike had conveniently omitted. You see, Pike boomed, clapping his hands together. A perfect gentleman. It is all settled. It was not settled. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild thing trapped in a cage. But one look at her aunt's desolate face told her she had no choice. She was as tethered to Miriam's weakness as a calf to a roping post. To refuse was to condemn them both. The ceremony, if one could call it that, took place in the dusty yard between the post and the forge. It was a spectacle of humiliation. Pike had summoned Sheriff Jonas Hale, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromises made in the name of keeping a fragile peace. The sheriff looked grim, his gaze shifting from Pike's smug face to Evelyn's rigid posture. This is irregular, Pike, Hale said, his voice a low grumble. It is a private contract. Sheriff, a personal arrangement to ensure peace on my trade routes. You are here to witness it, to make it official. A protection agreement. Is that not what the law is for protection? Hale knew a lie when he heard one, but he also saw the circle of Pike's men, including the menacing Clyde Weller, whose hands never strayed far from his gun. He saw the silent, watchful Comanche, and he saw the potential for bloodshed if he pushed too hard. He was a man of pragmatism, not principle. He pulled a folded paper and a pen from his coat. Sign here, he said to Evelyn, his voice devoid of emotion. It states you enter this protection agreement of your own free will. Evelyn's hand shook as she took the pen. Of her own free will. The words were a bitter joke. She looked at Tahay, who stood before her. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes. Not pity, but a kind of shared understanding of the cage they were both being forced into. He was a pawn, too, in Pike's game. There was no ring. Instead, Tahay produced a thin, soft strip of deerskin. He took her left hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His fingers were long and calloused, the hands of a man who worked, who fought, who survived. He wrapped the deerskin around her wrist, tying it with a simple, secure knot. It was not a shackle, but it felt like one. The leather was warm against her skin, a foreign, intimate weight. Evelyn signed the paper, her name a jagged, angry scrawl. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. The blacksmith had stopped his hammering. A few drovers had paused on their way to the saloon. Their faces were a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. She was no longer Evelyn Hart, the quiet girl from the supply post. She was the white woman given to a Comanche. As soon as the ink was dry, Pike was all business. "Excellent. The debt is cleared. Miriam, my wagons will roll tomorrow. Tahé, your bride, is now your responsibility." Miriam sobbed quietly, turning away in shame. Evelyn stood frozen, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, the deerskin on her wrist a brand. She was an object, traded and sold. Her pride, the one thing she thought she owned, lay shattered in the red dust at her feet. She looked at Tahé, her eyes blazing with a helpless fury. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance, and moved to retrieve the reins of her horse. He did not speak to her. He did not have to. The agreement was made. The sun began its slow descent, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The news, twisted and amplified, traveled faster than a prairie fire. Inside the saloon, the air grew thick with whiskey fumes and ugly talk. Clyde Weller, his voice loud and slurring, held court at the bar. "Heard the news?" he sneered to the crowd. "Pike's gone and bought himself some peace. Bought it with the Hart girl. Just handed her over to that Comanche buck. A Comanche and his new wife." A low murmur rippled through the room. The story took root, its poisonous tendrils wrapping around the prejudices and fears of the men drinking at the bar. The narrative shifted from a forced contract to a savage's purchase, from a desperate measure to a willing transaction. Outside, in the growing twilight, Clyde Weller leaned against a porch post, rolling a cigarette. He watched the supply post, his eyes narrowed to slits. He saw the silhouette of Tahé preparing the horses, and the smaller, rigid figure of the girl standing beside him. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. The trouble was just beginning. He and Pike had planned for it. They were counting on it. They left as twilight bled across the plains, erasing the hard edges of the horizon and softening the world into shades of gray and deep indigo. The supply post, the only home Evelyn had ever truly known, shrank behind them until it was just another dark shape against the dying light. She did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge the ghost of a choice she never had. She rode with her spine straight, her jaw set, a small, rigid figure of defiance against the immense, swallowing emptiness of the prairie. The silence between them was as vast as the land itself. Tahé rode a few paces ahead, his posture relaxed, his movements economical and sure. He did not speak, did not offer comfort or explanation. He simply led them away from the town, following a trail invisible to Evelyn's eyes, a path written in a language of flattened grass and subtle shifts in the terrain. The only sounds were the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the dry earth, the creak of saddle leather, and the mournful, ever-present sigh of the wind. When the darkness was complete, broken only by a sliver of moon and a spray of impossibly bright stars, he finally drew rein in the shallow lee of a rock outcropping. He dismounted in a single fluid motion. "We will make camp here," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried clearly in the still air. Evelyn slid from her saddle, her muscles aching with a tension that had been building all day. She watched, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as he unsaddled his pony and began rubbing it down with a handful of dry grass. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was almost hypnotic. He expected her to do the same, and after a moment's stubborn hesitation, she did, her movements clumsy and jerky by comparison. He built a fire not with wood, for there was none, but with dried buffalo chips he collected from a small pouch. The flames caught quickly, casting a small, flickering circle of warmth and light into the immense dark. The fire smelled earthy and surprisingly clean. He laid out his bedroll on one side of the fire and gestured with his chin to her saddlebags. "Your blankets are there. Sleep on that side." The space he left between them was deliberate and wide. As she unrolled her bedding, he spoke again, his gaze steady on the flames. "This arrangement is a matter of honor. As I said, I was given a promise that my people would be dealt with fairly and that the trade of whiskey that sickens them would be stopped. Pike was given a promise that his wagons would be safe. You are the seal on that promise." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I am your protector. Evelyn Hart, not your husband. I will not touch you. I will keep you safe until this agreement has served its purpose. That is my word." Evelyn said nothing. The words were a small comfort, a single solid stone in a whirlpool of uncertainty. But they did not change the fact that she was here, in the middle of nowhere, with a man the world had taught her to fear. She lay down on her bedroll, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin, and pretended to sleep. Sometime later, the distant, yipping cries of a coyote pack drifted on the wind, a lonely sound that echoed the desolation in her own heart. The days that followed fell into a harsh rhythm. They rode from sunup to sundown, pushing deeper into the vast, table-flat expanse of the Llano Estacado. This was a land that tolerated no mistakes. The sun was a relentless hammer, the wind a constant thief, stealing moisture from the air and the skin. Tahei seemed a part of it, his brown skin impervious to the sun, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the clouds and the birds. He remained distant, a man of few words, but his actions were a constant, quiet lesson. He showed her how to properly cinch her saddle so it would not chafe her horse on long rides. He taught her to look for the faint green of cottonwood trees in the distance, a sure sign of a hidden water source. One afternoon, under a sky the color of a hot skillet, he stopped and pointed. "See there, the clouds are flat on the bottom, like a tabletop. That means hail is coming." Evelyn saw only ordinary white clouds. An hour later, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and ice pellets the size of acorns hammered down on them, forcing them to take shelter with the horses under a rocky overhang. The sudden, violent cold was a shock after the day's heat. Huddled in her blanket, shivering, she watched him, realizing with a jolt that he had just saved them from serious injury. It was the first crack in the wall of her prejudice. She had seen his knowledge, and it was real. Her stubbornness remained. A hard kernel of pride she refused to yield. She would not ask for help, even when her water canteen was nearly empty and her lips were cracked and bleeding. She would wait for him to offer, but he did not. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, letting her struggle reach its peak. Finally, when she was so thirsty she could barely swallow the dust coating her throat, he led them off the main trail toward a canyon of crumbling red rock. "There is water here," he said. She saw nothing but dry stone and scrubby mesquite. He dismounted and walked to a sheer rock face, running his hand along a dark, vertical stain. He pressed his fingers into a narrow crevice she had not even noticed, and then brought them to his lips. He nodded, and with the tip of his knife, began to carefully chip away at the rock. A slow, miraculous trickle of water began to seep out, cool and clear. He collected it in a small leather cup, drop by precious drop. He handed the first cup to her. Evelyn stared at the water, then at him. He had known she was suffering. He had waited, testing her, and now he was offering her life. She drank, the water a shock of cold, clean relief. It was more than just water. It was a concession. It was the moment she admitted to herself that without him, she would not survive out here. Her survival depended on the skills of a man she was supposed to despise. The true test came several days later. The sky had been a hazy yellow-gray all morning, and the air was thick and still, charged with a strange electricity. Tahei pushed their pace, his jaw tight with a tension she had not seen before. A low rumble began in the distance, a sound that was not thunder. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. A wall of brown dust rose on the horizon, a churning, monstrous thing that blotted out the sun. "Dust storm!" he yelled over the rising wind. "To the arroyo." He spurred his horse toward a deep, dry gully carved into the prairie. They scrambled down the steep bank just as the storm hit, a blinding, choking whirlwind of sand and fury. The world disappeared. Evelyn could not see more than a foot in front of her face. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to tear her from the saddle. She huddled low, covering her mouth and nose with her bandana. Her eyes squeezed shut against the stinging grit. And then the rain began. Not a gentle rain, but a sudden, violent deluge. The hard-packed earth of the arroyo, baked dry for months, could not absorb the sudden flood. Water began to pour down the banks, turning the floor of the gully into a churning brown river. "We must get out," Tahei shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and water. He urged his pony up the slick, muddy bank. The horse scrambled for purchase, its hooves slipping in the muck. Evelyn watched in horror as the section of the bank beneath them began to crumble. With a great sucking sound, the earth gave way. The horse screamed, its back legs plunging into the rising torrent. Tahei was thrown from the saddle, his body landing hard against the crumbling edge, one leg trapped beneath his struggling animal. For a heartbeat, Evelyn froze. A cold, terrible thought shot through her mind. If she rode on, she would be free. No one would ever know. It would be an accident, a casualty of the storm. But then she saw his face. He was not looking at her with fear, but with a fierce, burning intensity. He was fighting, trying to pull his leg free while simultaneously trying to calm his terrified horse. And in that instant, she saw not a Comanche, not a savage, not her captor, but a man fighting for his life, just as she was. She did not think, she acted, kicking her own horse forward. She leaned down and grabbed the reins of Tahei's pony, pulling with all her might. "Get up!" she screamed, her voice raw against the storm. "Pull!" Her horse dug in its hooves, straining against the weight. The terrified pony, feeling the steady pull, found a last ounce of strength and scrambled forward, dragging itself from the water's pull. Tahei yanked his leg free, rolling away just as another section of the bank collapsed into the churning flood below. They made it to the top, soaked, shivering, and covered in mud. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a scrubbed, clean world and the roar of the flash flood in the arroyo. They stood there, their horses panting, their chests heaving. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He had a long, bleeding gash on his cheek where a rock had struck him. He slowly raised a hand and touched the deerskin band on her wrist. "You saved my life," he said, his voice quiet. "You would have done the same for me," she replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. And she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that it was true. They rode on in a new kind of silence. It was no longer a silence of hostility and mistrust, but one of shared experience. The barrier between them had been breached. Late the next day, they crested a low rise and saw the trading post they had been heading for, or what was left of it. A plume of thin gray smoke still curled into the clear blue sky from a pile of blackened timbers. The place had been burned to the ground. A cold dread settled over Evelyn. They approached cautiously. The silence was eerie. There were no bodies, but the signs of a struggle were everywhere. Overturned barrels, scattered goods, the dark stain of spilled molasses on the ground. Tahei dismounted and began to circle the wreckage, his eyes fixed on the churned-up earth. He knelt, examining a set of hoof prints. "Pike's wagons were never here," he said, his voice grim. He pointed to the tracks, but his man was... Evelyn looked closer. The hoof prints were sharp and clear in the damp soil, and in each one there was a distinct, unnatural mark, a small letter C deliberately nicked into the iron of the horseshoe. She had seen that mark before. On the horse Clyde Weller rode. A chilling realization washed over her. This was not a raid. It was a setup. The fire, the destruction, it was all a lie. A piece of theater designed to cast blame, designed to be found. And they had been led right to it. The flames that had consumed this small outpost were meant to ignite a much larger fire. And Tahai, she now understood with sickening clarity, was meant to be the spark. The smell of ash and deceit hung heavy in the air. Before Tahai could elaborate on his discovery, the sound of approaching riders sent a fresh jolt of alarm through Evelyn. It was not the disorganized clatter of a posse, but the steady, rhythmic beat of trained horses. A cavalry patrol. They emerged from a shallow draw, their blue uniforms a stark, official presence against the scorched landscape. The soldier in the lead, a corporal with a weary but decent face, raised a hand in greeting. Though his eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in the scene, he recognized Tahai immediately. A flicker of surprise followed by a nod of respect. "Tahai," the corporal said, dismounting. "My name is Ben Caro. We have met before, at Fort Griffin. What happened here?" "Corporal Caro," Tahai acknowledged, his voice even. "It appears this post was burned. We arrived only a short while ago." Ben Caro's gaze shifted to Evelyn, taking in her disheveled state, the deerskin band on her wrist, and the tension in her posture. He was too professional to stare, but the question was plain in his eyes. "We are investigating a separate matter," Caro said, turning his attention back to the ruins. "An army payroll wagon went missing 2 days ago on this route. We found the wagon abandoned, the guards gone, and the strongbox broken open. The tracks led in this direction before scattering." His jaw tightened. The official theory is that it was a Comanche or Kiowa raiding party. Tahai's expression remained impassive, but Evelyn saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "The theory is convenient," he said. "It is also wrong." He led Caro to the ground where the distinctive horseshoe prints were still visible. "Look here. These tracks were made by a horse shot at the forge in town. The blacksmith adds a small letter C to his work for Mr. Clyde Weller." Ben knelt, examining the print closely. He scraped away some of the dirt, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I know Weller. He is Ephraim Pike's right-hand man." "Pike has been complaining about Comanche raids for months," Tahai explained, his voice low and urgent. "But his wagons are the only ones troubled. He creates the danger himself. He has his men stage these attacks, then he blames my people. Fear drives up the price he can charge for freighting. It makes settlers nervous, willing to sell their land for cheap. This payroll robbery, this fire, it is all part of his plan to start a war he can profit from." Ben Caro stood up, dusting the dirt from his hands. He looked from the tracks to Tahai's earnest face. "It is a strong accusation. Tahai, I believe you, but believing and proving are two different things in a courtroom. I have orders to follow any trail that points toward the reservation." He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "All I have here are hoof prints. What a judge needs is a witness, or the stolen money, or Pike's signature on a confession." The news of the burned trading post and the missing payroll reached Sheriff Hale by telegraph. He read the flimsy paper in his office, the official report already spinning a tale of savage depredations. He crumpled it in his fist. He knew Pike was a venomous snake, but the man was careful. He operated through whispers, threats, and proxies, his own hands always appearing clean, without hard evidence. Hale's authority was limited. He was one man tasked with policing a territory larger than some eastern states, a territory where fear was more powerful than the law. For Evelyn, the corporal's words echoed a conflict that was raging inside her. She had seen the tracks. She had heard the quiet conviction in Tahai's voice. In her heart, a fragile, new trust was taking root. He had protected her, taught her, and saved her from the storm. But every lesson she had ever learned, every whispered warning from her childhood, screamed that she should trust the uniform, the badge, the official paper. The law was supposed to be a fortress of reason against the chaos of the frontier. Yet here was Corporal Caro, a man of that law, admitting its own powerlessness against a lie. Was the law just a collection of words on paper, as easily burned as the trading post? Who did she trust, the evidence of her own eyes, or the weight of the world she came from? As they traveled cautiously back in the direction of the town, keeping to the low ground, she saw something new on the landscape. Men were stretching long lines of wire across the prairie, taut strands of metal bristling with sharp barbs. The wire sliced across the open range, a stark declaration of ownership that had not been there a week before. It was a fence not just of metal, but of intent. A line drawn between what was owned and what was wild, between one man's property and another's. It was the world Pike was building, a world of sharp divisions and captured land, and Evelyn felt a profound sense of loss for the unbroken horizon she had always known. The true poison, however, was not spreading across the land, but on paper, in town. The latest edition of the Panhandle Clarion had hit the dusty streets. On the front page, under a bold, dramatic headline, was a story spun from rumor and malice. Virgin bride stolen by Comanche savage. It declared the article was a masterpiece of insinuation, painting Evelyn as a helpless victim and Tahay as a brutal predator. It spoke of a forced ceremony and her being dragged into the wilderness. It mentioned her aunt, Miriam Hart, as a grieving guardian, too terrified to speak out against the Red Menace. The paper was like a match thrown on dry tinder. It gave the town's simmering fear and prejudice a name and a face. Men gathered in the saloon. The newspaper passed from hand to hand, each reading fueling their righteous anger. Ephraim Pike sat in a corner, buying rounds of whiskey and quietly stoking the flames. That afternoon, a small group of these men, calling themselves the Citizens Protection Committee, paid a visit to Miriam Hart. They were not lawmen. They were shopkeepers and ranch hands, their faces grim, their belts heavy with pistols. They found her alone in the supply post, her eyes red from weeping. "Ma'am," their leader said, removing his hat, "we are here about your niece, about what that savage did." Miriam trembled. I cannot speak of it." "You must," the man insisted, his voice hardening. "The whole territory needs to know the truth. You need to provide a statement. Tell us how he took her. Tell us you were forced into it. For the safety of all our women, you need to sign a complaint." They crowded around her, their presence filling the small room, their questions like hammer blows. Miriam was not a strong woman. Her fear of Pike was now dwarfed by her fear of this angry mob and the scandal they represented. Cornered and terrified, she finally broke. She tearfully agreed with their version of the story, that Evelyn had been taken against her will, that she had been powerless to stop it. They produced a prepared document, and with a shaking hand, Miriam signed her name. Pike did not wait. With a sensational newspaper article in one hand and Miriam's coerced, tear-stained statement in the other, he rode directly to the county seat. He did not go to Sheriff Hale, whom he knew would ask too many difficult questions. He went straight to the circuit judge, a man with political ambitions and a deep-seated fear of appearing soft on the Indian problem. Pike presented his case with practiced solemnity. He showed the judge the newspaper, a testament to the outrage of the good citizens. He presented Miriam's statement, the tearful plea of a victim's family. He painted a picture of a brutal kidnapping that threatened the very fabric of their society. The judge, swayed by the apparent evidence and the political pressure, did not hesitate. He picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed his name to the document Pike had prepared. It was an official warrant, carrying the full weight of territorial law. It called for the immediate arrest of Tahay of the Comanche Nation, on the capital charge of kidnapping. The norther that swept down from the plains that evening had a razor's edge. The temperature plummeted, and a thin crystalline layer of frost formed on the dry grass, crunching under the horses' hooves. They found shelter in Cottonwood Draw, a winding gully thick with dormant trees and brush that offered some protection from the biting wind. Tahay built a small, smokeless fire in a pit, its warmth a meager defense against the profound, bone-deep cold of the night. There was a fragile truce between them now, forged in the floodwaters of the arroyo and solidified by the shared knowledge of Pike's treachery. They were fugitives, though they had committed no crime. The warrant for Tahay's arrest would be spreading through the territory like a contagion. Every lawman, every bounty hunter, every citizen with a grudge would be looking for them. For him, and for her, the woman he had supposedly stolen. They ate in silence, a piece of hardtack and dried meat each. From the direction of the town, a faint, unnatural orange glow began to stain the black horizon. Tahay noticed it first. He rose to his feet, his body instantly alert, and climbed the side of the draw to get a better view. Evelyn followed, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The glow was growing, brightening, pulsing like a malevolent heart. It was a prairie fire, and it was moving toward them with terrifying speed, pushed by the fierce, northeasterly wind. The smell of smoke, acrid and oily, began to snake its way into the draw. "It is not a natural fire," Tahay said, his voice a low, grim rumble. "It was set, deliberately, to drive us out into the open?" He did not have to say who had set it. The cruelty of the act had Clyde Weller's signature all over it. They were being hunted with flames. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Evelyn. The walls of the draw, which had offered shelter moments before, now felt like the jaws of a trap. "We have to run," she cried, turning for the horses. "No," Tahay said, his hand closing on her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "The fire is faster than any horse. We would be run down and consumed. We will fight it here." He scrambled back down into the gully, pulling his axe from his saddle. With swift, powerful blows, he began clearing a wide swath of brush and dry grass, working his way from their small camp toward the oncoming blaze. "Get your blanket," he commanded over the growing roar. "Soak it in what is left of the water. We are going to burn our own path." Evelyn understood. A backfire. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. She worked frantically, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear, dousing her wool blanket from their canteens. The air grew thick and hot, and ash began to rain down around them, glowing embers that hissed as they hit the frosted ground. Just as Tahay was about to set the backfire, a new sound cut through the din. It was the terrified whinny of a horse, followed by a child's scream. "Help somebody, please help me." Peering through the smoke, they saw a figure stumbling through the draw, pulling a panicked horse behind her. It was a young girl, no more than 12, her face smudged with soot and tears. It was Mercy, the orphaned black girl who sometimes helped the blacksmith. Her horse, its eyes wide with terror, was pulling against her, threatening to bolt directly into the path of the approaching inferno. Without a word, Tahay changed direction. He sprinted toward the girl, moving with a speed and grace that defied the treacherous, uneven ground. "Evelyn, create the firebreak now, do not wait," he yelled over his shoulder. He had trusted her. He had given her the most critical task while he ran toward the greater danger. For a second, she hesitated, the weight of the responsibility threatening to crush her. But then she saw the wall of orange flame licking at the edge of the draw, a monstrous, living thing, and she knew there was no time for doubt. Using a burning branch from their campfire, she touched it to the edge of the line Tahay had cleared. The dry grass ignited instantly, a line of friendly fire racing away from them, creating a blackened, barren strip of earth that the larger blaze would not be able to cross. Meanwhile, Tahay reached Mercy. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. He took the reins from her trembling hands and began to speak to the horse, not in English, but in the soft, guttural tones of his own language. He laid a hand on the animal's quivering neck, and slowly, miraculously, the horse began to quiet, its panicked snorting subsiding into deep, shuddering breaths. The main fire reached the edge of the draw, A roaring wave of heat and destruction. It hit their firebreak and, for a terrifying moment, threatened to leap across. But the burned ground held. The flames, starved of fuel, swirled and eddied along the black line before sweeping past on either side. Continuing their hungry rampage across the prairie, they were safe, huddled on a small island of blackened earth, surrounded by a sea of fire. The aftermath was an apocalyptic vision. The world was black and smoking, the skeletons of the cottonwood trees stark against a sky now glowing with a diffuse, hellish light. The cold had been replaced by a suffocating heat radiating from the scorched ground. Mercy was sobbing quietly, her body shaking with reaction. Evelyn felt a sharp, searing pain in her forearm and looked down to see a long, angry red welt where a flying ember had burned her. Tahei led them to the center of the burned area, where the ground was coolest. He settled the still trembling horse, then turned his attention to them. He looked at Mercy first, his eyes gentle. "You are safe now. You were very brave." He then looked at Evelyn, his gaze falling on her burned arm. "Let me see." She held it out, wincing as he gently touched the skin around the burn. He produced a small leather pouch from his belt. From it, he took a pinch of dried leaves and a small lump of what looked like tallow. He crushed the leaves in his palm, mixing them with the fat to create a soothing, fragrant salve. "My cousin, Naylene, is a healer," he explained as he carefully applied the poultice to Evelyn's arm. "She taught me this. It will take the fire out and keep the skin from blistering." His touch was incredibly gentle, his focus absolute. In that moment, sitting in the ruin of the fire, the intimacy of the simple act was overwhelming. They sat together by the dying embers of their own small campfire, the only source of light in a world gone dark. Mercy, exhausted, had fallen asleep, her head resting on Tahei's saddle. "Why were you out here?" Mercy, Evelyn asked softly, not wanting to wake her. Tahei answered for her. "She told me she overheard Clyde Weller talking in the saloon. He was bragging to another man about how he was going to smoke out the savage and his woman. She was scared for us. She took one of the blacksmith's horses to try and warn us." Evelyn stared at the sleeping girl, her heart aching. This child had risked her life for them, for two outcasts, the complexity of this world, its unexpected pockets of courage and kindness, was more than she could fathom. The shared danger and the quiet aftermath had stripped away their final defenses. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of his body a comfort against the encroaching chill. "The whiskey Pike sells," Tahei said suddenly, his voice low, his eyes on the sleeping child. "It is poison, not just to the body." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a distant pain. "When I was a boy, we had a winter of great hunger. The buffalo did not come. The sickness came instead. It took many of our people. It took my mother." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes reflecting the deep sorrow of the memory. She burned with a fever for days. Naylene and the other healers did all they could, but we had no Western medicine, and our own was not enough. She died before the snows melted. I remember the hunger, but I remember the helplessness more. Later, the whiskey traders like Pike came. They brought their bottles and their false promises. I saw good men, strong warriors, lose themselves to it. I saw families broken. It was the same helplessness, the same sickness, but this one was a choice they were tricked into making. I hate it. I hate the men who sell it more than I hate any enemy I have faced in battle. The confession was raw and real, a glimpse into the heart of the man beside her. He was not fighting Pike for territory or for pride. He was fighting him for the memory of his mother, for the soul of his people. Evelyn felt her own walls crumble. "I was an orphan," she whispered, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She had never spoken of it to anyone. "My parents died of cholera on the trail to Texas. Miriam is my mother's sister. She took me in, but I have always been a debt, a mouth to feed. Another burden in a hard life. I have worked since I could walk, to try and repay it. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. All my life, I have been so afraid of what people would say, afraid of being an outcast. When they made me, when we were joined, all I could think about was the shame. I heard them whisper. I knew what they would call me. A squaw. Worse, something dirty. I was so afraid of that name that I could not see the man. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. I was a coward. He reached out and gently took her hand. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and strong. You are not a coward. Evelyn Hart, you saved my life in the arroyo. You stood with me tonight. You have the heart of a warrior. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a weariness beyond bone and muscle settling over her. He did not pull away. They sat there for a long time, two survivors in a scarred world, finding a fragile peace in the shared warmth of their touch. The barrier of race, of prejudice, of fear had been burned away, leaving only the simple, undeniable truth of two people holding on to each other in the darkness. But peace on the frontier is a fleeting thing. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to creep over the blackened horizon, a new sound reached them, the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of men's voices. Evelyn's head snapped up. Tahei was already on his feet, his hand on his knife. Through the lingering haze of smoke, they saw them, a ring of riders, their forms silhouetted against the rising sun. There were at least a dozen of them, armed with rifles, their faces hard and grim in the morning light. It was the Citizens Protection Committee. They had them surrounded. A moment later, a single rider broke through the line. It was Sheriff Jonas Hale, but he was too late. He was not leading the posse. He was following it. The law had not come to save them. It had come to watch the mob deliver its own brutal brand of justice. The men's faces were hard masks of righteousness in the cold dawn light. They sat their horses in a loose, menacing circle, rifles held loosely across their saddles, their collective gaze a physical weight of hatred directed at Tahei. At the forefront was a tall, gaunt man with a fanatic's gleam in his eyes, a coiled rope already in his hand. The long shadow of a thick cottonwood branch stretched across the blackened ground, falling over the group like a waiting gallows. Sheriff Hale pushed his horse forward, placing himself between the mob and their quarry. Now hold on, Jedediah. We will do this by the book. He has a right to a trial. Jedediah spat on the ground. His trial is right here. We found him with the woman he stole, hiding out after his kind robbed and burned decent folk. The newspaper told it plain. His aunt signed the complaint. That is all the book we need. He shook the rope, the loop swinging gently. That cottonwood has a strong branch. It will hold him. A murmur of agreement ran through the men. They were a single entity, a beast with many heads, and it was hungry. Tahei stood perfectly still, his face a calm, unreadable sculpture. He did not look at the men, at the rope, or at the sheriff. He looked at Evelyn. His eyes did not ask for help or offer apology. They simply held hers, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that had finally broken over them. In that look, something inside Evelyn solidified, turning from frightened uncertainty into a hard, defiant core. She had been a piece of paper, signed and traded. She had been a survivor, enduring the wilderness. Now, she would be a shield. She stepped forward, moving to stand directly in front of Tahei, her small frame the only thing between him and the mob. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break, but she planted her feet in the scorched earth. No, she said. Her voice was a reedy thing in the vast, cold air, but it was clear. You will not? Jedediah's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in contempt. Get out of the way, girl. This does not concern you. We are here to save you from him. Save me. Evelyn's voice gained strength, fueled by a sudden surge of bitter anger. You did not save me when Ephraim Pike sold me to settle a debt. You did not save me when this man taught me how to find water in a dry land. And you certainly did not save me last night when Pike's man set a fire to kill us both." She pointed a trembling finger at the sleeping form of Mercy, wrapped in a blanket near the dying fire. "Ask that child who the real savages are." She turned her gaze on Sheriff Hale, a direct, desperate appeal. "Sheriff, you are the law here, are you not? You witnessed the paper. You called it a protection agreement. Well, protect him. Do your duty. You cannot let them do this." Sheriff Hale looked from Evelyn's fierce, pleading face to the ugly mood of the men. He was a man caught in a closing vice. His badge felt like a useless piece of tin, but Evelyn's words had given him an opening, a sliver of legal high ground. "She is right, Jedediah," Hale said, his voice carrying a new authority. "She is the complaining witness in this, and she is not complaining. Under territorial statute, I am obligated to take any accused man into protective custody if there is a threat of public violence. He will be brought to my jail, and the circuit judge can sort it out when he next comes through. That is the law." "The law is too slow," another man shouted. Just then, more riders appeared, cresting the rise. It was Corporal Ben Caro and 2 of his troopers. They rode down into the draw, their blue uniforms and disciplined formation a stark contrast to the raggedy posse. Ben took in the scene with a quick, practiced eye the mob, the rope, Evelyn standing guard over Tahai. He dismounted and walked to the sheriff's side. "Morning, Sheriff. Looks like you have your hands full." He nodded toward Tahai. "I can tell you this much. My patrol and I can place him and the girl a full day's ride from that payroll wagon when it was robbed, and those horseshoe tracks at the burned-out post, I saw them myself. They belong to Clyde Weller's horse. This man," he gestured to Tahai, "is being set up." The corporal's words, coming from a United States soldier, were a douse of cold water on the mob's hot fury. It did not extinguish their hate, but it gave them pause. An argument against a Comanche was one thing, an argument against the army was another. Jedediah glared, but he slowly, reluctantly, recoiled his rope. "Fine. Sheriff, take him. But if that judge lets him go, we will see to justice ourselves." The ride back to town was a grim procession. Tahai's hands were bound in front of him, a concession to the mob, but he rode his own horse, his head held high. Evelyn rode beside him, ignoring the hostile stares and muttered insults that followed them like a cloud of flies. When they reached the town's main street, it was lined with onlookers. The story in the Clarion had done its work. They were a spectacle, the savage and his woman, proof of all the town's darkest fears. Sheriff Hale locked Tahai in one of the 2 cells in his small office. It was a cage of thick iron bars. Through the front window, Evelyn could see the saloon across the street. It was already full, the doors swinging open and shut as men crowded in. A trial by tavern was now in session. Inside, Ephraim Pike was buying drinks, his voice a low, persuasive rumble. He moved from table to table, clapping men on the back, leaving coins in his wake. Evelyn watched as men who had never even spoken to Tahai began to nod grimly, their memories suddenly full of stories of his supposed arrogance, his violent temper, his thieving nature. Pike was not just buying whiskey, he was buying a verdict, one lie at a time. Sheriff Hale poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Evelyn. Her hands shook so badly the hot liquid sloshed over the rim. "You did a brave thing back there, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "A foolish thing, but brave." "It was the truth," she said, her voice hollow. "The truth does not always count for much out here," Hale admitted. Looking out the window at the growing crowd, the judge will hear the official complaint. He will hear the testimony of the townsfolk Pike is paying for right now, and he will hear from Corporal Caro. Then he will hear from you. What you say will carry the most weight, but you should know, if you speak for him, this town will never look at you the same way again. You will be an outcast. Are you prepared for that? Evelyn looked through the bars at Tahai. He was standing at the back of the cell, watching her. He had not said a word since they had taken him. He did not need to. She remembered his gentleness as he tended her burn, his quiet grief when he spoke of his mother, his courage as he ran to save a child from a fire. She remembered him calling her a warrior. The town could call her whatever it wanted. She knew who she was now. She walked to the sheriff's desk, her resolve hardening with every step. "Give me a pen and paper. Sheriff, I want to write my statement, as a witness, for the defense." Just as she sat down, the office door burst open. Clyde Weller stormed in, his face a mask of theatrical outrage. He was followed by 2 other men from the posse, their expressions eager and mean. Sheriff Clyde bellowed, pointing a dramatic finger at Tahai. "We have proof of what this animal did to that poor girl." He strode to the desk and threw a small object down on the wooden surface. It landed with a soft, sickening thud. It was a strip of deerskin, the same soft leather Tahai had tied around her wrist, but this one was stiff and dark, stained with what was unmistakably dried blood. "I found this on the trail near the draw," Clyde announced to the room, his voice ringing with triumph. "He attacked her. Sheriff, he fought her and took her by force. Here is the proof. He made her bleed." The silence in the sheriff's office was a vacuum, sucking all the air from Evelyn's lungs. The bloody deerskin lay on the desk, a vile, obscene accusation. For a moment, the world was a frozen tableau. Clyde's triumphant sneer, the posse's eager, hungry eyes, Sheriff Hale's stony expression, and Tahai, a figure of absolute stillness in his iron cage. Evelyn's own wrist, the one still encircled by the soft, clean leather Tahai had tied there, began to tingle with a phantom pain. The lie was so audacious, so vile. It was almost brilliant. It was a story the town wanted to believe, a tangible symbol for all their whispered fears. But the shock lasted only a heartbeat. It was replaced by a cold, clear rage that burned away all her fear. She had been pushed, and now she would push back. "That is a lie," she said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. She stepped forward, holding up her own wrist so everyone could see the unblemished deerskin band. "This is the one he tied on me. It has never been off. And this," she held up her other hand, turning it over, showing the clean, uninjured skin, "is the other one. Where is this blood from? Mr. Weller, did you cut yourself while you were butchering a rabbit for your supper?" Clyde's face darkened, his triumph faltering. "You are lying to protect him. He has you bewitched." "She does not look bewitched to me," Sheriff Hale said, his voice a low growl. He picked up the bloody strip of leather with the tip of a letter opener, holding it away from himself as if it were a dead snake. "She looks angry, and last I checked, providing false evidence to a lawman is a serious crime." "It is not false," one of the other men blustered. "We believe Clyde." "I do not care what you believe," Hale snapped, his patience finally gone. "I care what can be proven. Now all of you, get out of my office. This is an official investigation, not a saloon debate. Go on, get." Grumbling, the men backed out, Clyde shooting a look of pure venom at Evelyn before he slammed the door behind him. The sudden quiet was a relief, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Sheriff Hale dropped the bloody leather into a drawer and locked it. He turned to Evelyn, his face grim. "They will not give up. You know, that piece of theater just now will be all over town in minutes. They will twist it. They will say you are too scared to tell the truth." He ran a hand over his weary face. "I have to go talk to the judge. Try to make him see reason before this gets any further out of hand. Corporal Caro is waiting for me. I am locking the main door. You will be safe in here. Do not open it for anyone." He left, the turn of the key in the lock echoing in the small room. Evelyn was alone with the man in the cage. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was no longer the quiet of strangers, or the truce of survivors. It was the heavy, charged silence of two people whose fates were now irrevocably bound, hanging by the thinnest of threads. She walked slowly to the cell, her boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He stood near the bars, watching her approach. The morning light from the single barred window cut across his face, illuminating the faint, healing scratch on his cheek from the arroyo, the proud set of his jaw, the deep, soul-steady calm in his eyes. He looked like a captive eagle, proud and unbroken even in his cage. She stopped just before the iron bars, so close she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. She could see the individual threads in his cotton shirt, the tiny lines around his eyes. She had to know. She had to ask the question that had been clawing at her heart since the fire. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Making this agreement, tying yourself to me." His gaze did not waver. He considered her question for a long moment, not as if searching for an answer, but as if weighing the truest way to say it. "When I first saw you," he said, his voice low and even, "you were standing in front of your aunt. Pike was looking at you. I know that look. It is the look of a man who sees something he can use and then discard. I saw it in the eyes of the whiskey traders. I saw it in the eyes of the men who drove my people from their winter grounds. It is the look of a predator. I knew, in that moment, that if I did not step into his path, he would devour you one way or another. He would take the trading post and he would take you as part of the price." He reached a hand through the bars, not to touch her, but as if to clear the air between them. "The arrangement was the only way I could put myself between you and him. It was the only shield I could offer that his own men, and the law, would be forced to recognize. I do not regret protecting you, Evelyn Hart. I only regret that my protection has brought you to this cage with me." He finally let his hand drop. "When this is over, when you are safe from him for good, I will cut this band from your wrist myself. You will be free of me. That was always my intent." The world shifted on its axis. Every moment since that humiliating ceremony in the dusty yard replayed in her mind. But now, with a different light, the distance he had kept, the formal respect, the patient lessons in survival. It had not been the cold indifference of a captor. It had been the careful honor of a guardian. He had not taken her as a prize. He had stood in front of her to take the blow meant for her. And she, in her fear and her pride, had been too blind to see it. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, tears of shame for her own blindness, of gratitude so immense it was a physical ache in her chest. She reached through the bars, her hand trembling, and gently touched the scratch on his cheek. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at her touch, a small, involuntary sigh escaping his lips. He took her hand in his palm warm and calloused against hers. He brought it to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, more intimate than any passionate embrace. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against the cold iron of the bars, her tears falling freely now. The words came then, rising from a place deep inside her that had been locked away for her entire life. They were a confession, an absolution, a declaration. "Forced to wed a young Comanche," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, the words tasting of truth on her tongue. "A virgin like me lost more than just her hand in marriage. I lost my foolish pride and found my own heart." She looked up, meeting his intense gaze through the bars. "I do not want you to cut this band. Tahe, not ever. The paper I signed was a lie I was forced into. The words I am saying now are the truest I have ever spoken. I choose this. I choose you." He searched her eyes, seeing the unwavering certainty there. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips for the first time, a smile that transformed his stoic face, lighting it from within. He brought his own forehead to the bars, pressing it against hers, the cold iron the only thing separating them. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, two souls choosing each other, forging a bond far stronger than any deerskin tie or legal document. A frantic scratching sound at the back door of the office broke the spell. It was followed by a small, urgent whisper. "Miss Evelyn, Miss Evelyn. Are you in there?" Evelyn's head shot up. It was Mercy's voice. She looked at Tahei, then hurried to the back door, her heart pounding. The sheriff had said not to open it for anyone, but this was Mercy. She unlocked it and cracked it open. The young girl slipped inside, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She was clutching something heavy in her hands, wrapped in an oily piece of burlap. "I heard what Mr. Weller said," Mercy whispered breathlessly, her chest heaving, "about the bloody leather. It was a lie. I knew it was, and I remembered something." She looked past Evelyn to Tahei in his cell and gave him a small, brave nod. "Mr. Weller, he is always bragging. A few weeks ago, he had my boss, Mr. Gable, make him something special, a new lock, for a special box he was minding for Mr. Pike. He said it was so special, no one could pick it. He had Mr. Gable put his mark on it, right on the front." Mercy carefully unwrapped the burlap. Resting in the cloth was a heavy, iron padlock. It was grimy and scratched, and on its face, near the keyhole, was a small, unmistakable letter C, hammered into the metal. "After the fire, after everyone left," Mercy continued, her words tumbling out in a rush, "I was scared to go back to town. I hid in the blacksmith's shed. Last night, Mr. Weller came back. He thought no one was there. He was drunk. He took this lock from his saddlebag and threw it into the scrap heap. He was cursing that it got all scratched up. He said he had to get rid of it." Evelyn stared at the padlock, her mind racing. An army payroll, a strong box broken open, a special lock. "Mercy," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with a dawning, brilliant hope. "Do you know what this is from?" The little girl nodded, her eyes shining with fierce intelligence. "It is the lock from the army wagon. Miss Evelyn, I saw the wagon when it passed through town. I saw this very lock on the strong box. I am sure of it. The heavy iron padlock felt like the key to the entire world." When Sheriff Hale and Corporal Caro returned, their faces etched with the fatigue of a fruitless argument with the judge, they stopped dead in the doorway. Hale stared at the lock in Evelyn's hands, his weary eyes widening. Ben Caro took the padlock, turning it over and over. He ran a thumb over the deep scratches and pry marks near the shackle. The report said the strongbox was pried open with a crowbar. He said, his voice tight with excitement, "These marks are consistent with that." He pointed to the small, stamped letter C. "And this ties it directly to Weller. Mercy, you are certain you saw him throw this away?" The young girl, standing straight and tall despite her fear, nodded. "Yes, sir, into the scrap heap behind the forge. He was angry it was so scratched up." It was the hard evidence Ben had spoken of, the physical proof that could cut through the web of lies Pike had so carefully woven. The tide had not yet turned, but for the first time, it had stopped rushing against them. Sheriff Hale made a decision. He could not release Tahei. The mob outside was too volatile, their anger stoked by Pike's whiskey and Weller's lies. But he could not leave him in a cage while the real criminals walked free. He looked at Ben Caro. "Corporal," Hale said, his voice firm, "I am officially releasing this prisoner into your custody for the purpose of assisting in an ongoing Army investigation. Your authority supersedes the local warrant, at least for now." He then turned to Evelyn and Mercy. "What you two know makes you essential witnesses. You will go with them." He unlocked the cell door. "Tahei, you will lead them. You will find the trail of those C-branded horseshoes, and you will not stop until you find where it ends." They left under the cover of darkness, slipping out the back of the sheriff's office and leading their horses through the quiet alleyways until they were clear of the town's sleeping houses. The small group was a strange, unlikely alliance: a soldier, a Comanche warrior, a determined young woman, and a brave child. They were 4 lonely points of light against a vast darkness. Tahei took the lead without a word, his eyes scanning the ground even in the faint moonlight. He moved with a silent, purposeful grace, a man in his element. He found the trail leading away from the burned-out draw. The distinctive horseshoe prints a clear path to follow. As they rode, the landscape unspooled around them. A familiar world made strange and hostile. The new barbed wire fences were everywhere, glinting like silver threads in the moonlight. They were forced to ride for miles along one such fence, a sharp, unyielding barrier that dictated their path. It was Pike's world, a place of hard lines and cruel divisions, and they were trespassers in it. The trail led them north, toward a desolate stretch of badlands, a place of crumbling mesas and twisted, skeletal junipers. It was land no one had bothered to claim because it was too rugged to farm and too poor to graze. It was the perfect place to hide something. As the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and pale gold, Tahei drew them to a halt at the mouth of a hidden canyon. Tucked inside, almost invisible against the red rock, was an old, dilapidated ranch house and a sagging barn. There were no cattle, no signs of life, but the C-branded tracks led directly to the barn door. Ben dismounted, his rifle held ready. "Evelyn, Mercy, you stay back with the horses. Tahei, with me." They approached the barn cautiously, the silence of the place unnervingly absolute. The large doors were barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam. It was not meant to keep things in, but to keep people out. Working together, they heaved the beam aside and slid the doors open, revealing a dusty, cavernous interior thick with the smell of stale whiskey and decay. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, illuminating a scene of organized crime. Against one wall were stacked dozens of wooden crates. Ben pried one open with his bayonet. It was filled with Army-issue ammunition, the stencils on the side matching the manifest from the stolen payroll wagon. Next to the ammunition were barrels, dozens of them, reeking of the raw, cheap alcohol that Pike had been peddling. But the greatest discovery was in the small, dusty tack room at the back. On a rough wooden table sat a thick, leather-bound ledger. Evelyn, unable to stay back, had crept to the barn door, with a Mercy close behind her. She watched as Tahei opened the book. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script that she recognized instantly as Ephraim Pike's. It was not just a record of freighting costs. It was the heart of his entire conspiracy, a meticulous accounting of his corruption. Tahei ran a finger down a page, his voice low as he read the entries aloud. October 10th, 5 barrels of whiskey to Jedediah for the Citizens Committee. October 12th, $20 to the editor of the Clarion for a prominent story. October 14th, 1 new saddle and a $50 bonus to C. Weller for services rendered. It was all there. Every bribe, every payment, every drop of poison he had poured into the community. There were entries detailing the cost of the barbed wire to fence off land he had acquired cheaply from frightened settlers. There were notes on the shipping schedules of the new railroad line, which he was using to bring in his illegal goods. It was a map of his greed, written in his own hand. This book would not just free Tahei, it would destroy Ephraim Pike. As they stood there, absorbing the magnitude of their discovery, a drama of a different kind was unfolding 20 miles away, in a small, impoverished settlement of Mexican families who had come to work on that same railroad. Tahei's cousin, Nalin, had been visiting, trading her knowledge of healing herbs for food. A frantic woman had brought her a small boy, her son, who was flushed with fever and racked with violent tremors. Nalin recognized the signs immediately. It was the sickness that came from bad spirits in a bottle. She worked quickly, forcing a cleansing tea of willow bark and yarrow down the child's throat to make him vomit up the poison. As she held the boy's head, the mother wept, telling a story of a man from the freight company who had come through their camp, selling cheap whiskey for twice its worth. Her husband had bought a bottle, hoping for a small comfort after a week of back-breaking labor. He had shared a little with his son, not knowing it was tainted. Nalin listened, her heart cold with anger. It was another piece of the puzzle, Another life damaged by Pike's avarice. The mother, grateful and desperate, promised she would tell her story to any lawman who would listen. Back at the ranch, the sense of victory was short-lived. As Ben Caro was carefully wrapping the ledger in an oilcloth, they heard the frantic beat of a horse's hooves approaching at a full gallop. It was one of the troopers Ben had left on watch on the ridge. He slid his sweating horse to a halt, his face pale with alarm. "Corporal," he gasped, "a rider from town just found us. It is the sheriff." He sent a message. "It is Pike." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over Evelyn. "He knows we are on to him," Ben said, his voice grim. "It is worse than that, sir," the trooper said, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. "He has gone to the Hart woman's supply post. He has taken her, Miss Miriam Hart. He has her as a hostage." Evelyn felt the ground beneath her sway. Her aunt, weak, fragile Miriam, who had buckled under the slightest pressure, was now in the hands of a desperate, cornered animal. The trooper pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "He sent this note to the sheriff. He says he will trade the woman for the Comanche and for any evidence we have found. He wants you to meet him at the old wooden bridge over Rabbit Creek at midnight. He says if you bring anyone else, or if you are late, he will kill her." The sky broke open as they rode, a sudden furious downpour that turned the dusty trail to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Rain lashed down in cold, stinging sheets, driven by a wind that moaned through the canyons like a grieving spirit. By the time they reached Rabbit Creek, it was no longer a creek but a raging, muddy torrent, its roar a constant, deep-throated threat in the darkness. The old wooden bridge spanned the churning water, its timbers groaning and shuddering with every fresh assault from the flood. In the center of the span, a single lantern cast a small, sickly yellow circle of light. Within that circle stood Ephraim Pike, his large frame shielded by a heavy oilskin coat. He held Miriam Hart in front of him, one beefy arm locked around her throat, a pistol pressed to her temple. Miriam was a pale, terrified ghost in the storm, her face a mask of pure terror. Beside them, Clyde Weller stood with a rifle, his thin frame tensed, his eyes darting nervously into the surrounding darkness. Evelyn, Tahei, and Ben dismounted in the meager cover of a thicket of willows, the roar of the water and the drumming of the rain providing a cloak for their approach. The ledger, wrapped securely in its oilcloth, was tucked into Ben's saddlebag. "He is desperate," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "That makes him unpredictable and dangerous. We do this my way. No surprises." They moved into the open, their hands held high and empty to show they were unarmed, though each had a pistol tucked away and accessible. They stopped at the edge of the bridge, the unstable planks swaying beneath their feet. Pike Ben Caro shouted, his voice a powerful baritone that cut through the noise. "We are here. Let the woman go." Pike's laughter was a harsh, ugly sound. "Not so fast. Corporal, the rules are mine tonight. First, the book. Throw it over here." Ben hesitated, then slowly pulled the wrapped ledger from his coat. With a swing of his arm, he tossed it across the slick planks. It landed near Pike's feet. Clyde Weller scurried forward to retrieve it, never taking his rifle off them. "Good," Pike grunted, his grip on Miriam tightening. "Now for the main event. Send the Comanche over. Alone. Once he is on this side, I will release the old woman." Miriam let out a choked sob, her eyes pleading with Evelyn. Tahei looked at Evelyn, his expression a calm, steady reassurance. This was the trap. The moment Tahei was on Pike's side of the bridge, they would all be shot. Evelyn's mind raced, faster than the floodwaters below. The lessons of the past weeks coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. She had learned to read the sky, to find water, to face the fire. Now she had to face the man who had started it all. She had a pistol tucked into the waistband of her skirt, its cold, hard weight a familiar secret. She had only ever used it for shooting at rabbits and tins. Tonight, she would use it to make an opening. "All right, Pike," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "He is coming." Tahei took a single step forward. In that same instant, a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a stark, momentary flash of white. In that flash, Evelyn saw everything Pike's eyes, wide and crazed, Clyde's nervous finger on the trigger, her aunt's tear-streaked face, and she saw her target. Not a man, but the lantern swinging from a wooden post just beside Clyde. As the world plunged back into darkness, the thunder cracking directly overhead, Evelyn moved. In one fluid motion, she drew her pistol, aimed, and fired. The shot was deafening. Even over the storm, the bullet shattered the lantern, plunging the bridge into absolute blackness. For a moment, there was only confusion. Clyde, startled by the shot from an unexpected quarter, fired his rifle blindly into the dark. The muzzle flash gave Ben Caro the location he needed. Ben's own pistol barked once, a single, precise shot. A strangled cry of pain came from the darkness, followed by the clatter of a rifle on the wooden planks. Clyde was down. Pike roared in fury, shoving Miriam away from him and firing his own pistol toward the spot where Evelyn stood. The bullet whined past her ear, but the distraction had worked. In the confusion, Tahei was already moving, not walking, but sprinting across the slick, treacherous bridge, his moccasins silent and sure. He hit Pike like a charging bull, a silent, deadly force in the dark. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, their grunts and curses lost in the roar of the storm. They were a thrashing knot of violence on the swaying bridge, lit only by the intermittent, ghostly flashes of lightning. Pike had the advantage of size, but Tahei had speed, skill, and a righteous fury that had been simmering for years. Evelyn ran forward, her heart in her throat, her gun held ready. She found her aunt huddled against the railing, sobbing hysterically. "It is all right, Miriam," Evelyn said, pulling her to her feet. "We have to get off the bridge." The fight between Tahei and Pike was brutal and primal. Pike's pistol had been knocked from his hand, skittering across the planks and into the raging creek. Now it was a matter of knives and fists. Tahei ducked under a wild swing from Pike and drove the heel of his hand into the larger man's throat. Pike staggered back, gasping for air. Tahei pressed his advantage, his knife flashing in the storm light. He disarmed Pike, sending his blade spinning into the water, and in a single, fluid movement, had the man on his back, the point of his own knife pressed against Pike's fleshy throat. For a heartbeat, all of time seemed to stop. In Pike's terrified, sputtering face, Tahei saw all the evil that had poisoned his world. He saw the faces of the men lost to whiskey, the hollow eyes of hungry children, the memory of his mother's fevered brow. Vengeance was a hot, sweet taste in his mouth. One quick movement, and it would all be over. Justice, swift and final. But then he saw Evelyn, her face pale in the darkness, helping her aunt toward safety. He saw Ben Caro kneeling over a wounded Clyde Weller. Applying a tourniquet, he saw the choice, the path of the killer, or the path of the protector, the law of the mob, or the fragile, difficult law of men trying to build something better. With a shuddering breath, he pulled back. He flipped the knife in his hand and brought the heavy pommel down hard on Pike's temple. The man went limp without a sound. Just as Tahei rose, there was a sound like a great beast groaning in its death throes. With a shriek of tortured wood and snapping timbers, the entire middle section of the bridge gave way. The planks beneath them dropped, plunging into the churning black water below. Evelyn and Miriam were on the town side of the chasm. Ben and the wounded Clyde were safe on the far bank, but Tahei, along with the unconscious Pike, was stranded on a small, teetering section of the bridge that was still connected to the far bank, but threatening to collapse at any moment. Tahei, Evelyn screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. The section of bridge he was on sagged, dipping dangerously toward the water. He quickly used his rope to tie Pike's hands and feet, ensuring the man would not be a threat. Then he looked across the new 10-foot gap of raging water that separated him from Evelyn. Ben Tahei shouted, "Your rope!" Ben, thinking fast, uncoiled the lariat from his saddle. He threw one end to Tahei, who caught it deftly. "What are you doing?" Evelyn cried. Securing the prisoner, Ben yelled back, "Then we will figure out how to get him across." Tahei tied the rope securely around the bound form of Pike. As he worked, Miriam, still dazed with fear, stumbled near the broken edge of the bridge. A loose plank shifted under her weight. She cried out as her feet slipped, and she plunged into the torrent. Without a second's hesitation, Evelyn dove in after her. The shock of the cold, powerful water stole her breath. The current was a physical beast, grabbing her, pulling her under. She fought her way to the surface, sputtering, and saw Miriam's pale face a few feet away, her eyes wide with terror as she was swept downstream. Evelyn Tahei's voice was a roar of desperation. He tied off the rope holding Pike, and without a thought for his own safety on the collapsing platform, he dove into the raging creek. He was a powerful swimmer, his movements strong and sure even against the current. He reached Miriam first, grabbing a handful of her dress and pulling her head above water. Evelyn fought her way toward them, the waterlogged weight of her skirt and boots dragging her down. Tahei saw her struggling. With a great effort, he pushed Miriam toward her. "Take her! Get to the bank!" he yelled. Evelyn grabbed her aunt, kicking with all her remaining strength toward the muddy bank. Just as her feet touched the slippery bottom, she looked back. A huge log, swept loose by the flood, was bearing down on Tahei. He tried to dive, but he was not fast enough. The log struck him a glancing blow, and he disappeared beneath the churning brown water. For a heart-stopping moment, the world was only the black, churning water and the empty space where Tahei had been. Evelyn's scream was a raw, wordless sound of pure terror. She scrambled along the muddy bank, her eyes straining against the darkness and the driving rain, searching for any sign of him. Ben Caro, having secured the ropes holding Pike and Weller, was already downstream, his soldier's discipline overriding the chaos. It was Ben who saw him first, a dark shape surfacing 20 yards downriver, tumbling in the current. Tahei was limp, his body moving with the water, not against it. Ben plunged into the shallows, bracing himself against the flood's pull, and managed to snag a handful of Tahei's buckskin shirt as he swept past. Evelyn was there a second later, grabbing Tahei's arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. Together, they dragged his unconscious form from the torrent, hauling him onto the slick, muddy bank. He was not breathing. His face was a ghastly pale in the stormy darkness, a long, dark bruise already forming on his temple where the log had struck him. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Evelyn, but then the memory of his calm, methodical teachings cut through her fear. Do not fight the land, understand it. She understood this. This was a battle for life. She turned him on his side, pressing hard on his back, forcing the river from his lungs in a sickening gush of muddy water. She pressed again and again, her movements frantic but purposeful. He choked, a deep, rattling cough that tore through his body. Water spewed from his mouth. He coughed again, then drew a ragged, shuddering breath. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. But they were open. He was alive. Evelyn collapsed beside him, her strength gone, and buried her face in his soaked shirt, her sobs lost in the unending roar of the storm. The trial of Ephraim Pike was not held in a grand courthouse, but in the town's largest meeting hall, which served as a courtroom whenever the traveling federal judge made his circuit. The room was packed, a tense, divided sea of faces. On one side sat Jedediah and the members of his committee, their expressions sullen and suspicious. On the other sat the town's blacksmith, a few families from the Mexican settlement, and a small, determined group from the colored community, their presence a quiet statement of solidarity. Pike sat beside his lawyer, looking unconcerned, almost bored. He was a man who believed in the power of money and influence, and he had spent a lifetime proving that they were more powerful than any law. Clyde Weller, his arm in a sling, sat behind him, his face a mask of dull resentment. The prosecution, handled by an earnest young attorney who traveled with the judge, began by laying out the physical evidence. Sheriff Hale and Corporal Caro presented the C-branded padlock, its scratches and pry marks a perfect match for the damage on the Army strongbox. They presented the stolen ammunition and the barrels of illegal whiskey found at the abandoned ranch. And then they presented the ledger. The attorney opened the thick, leather-bound book on the table before the judge. A man with a stern, hawkish face and eyes that missed nothing. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "we present the defendant's own business ledger, a meticulous record not only of his freighting company, but of a conspiracy to incite violence for profit." A low murmur went through the crowd. The judge silenced it with a single, sharp look. He spent a long time reading the book, his finger tracing the lines of Pike's neat script. He read the entries for payments to the newspaper, for whiskey distributed to the mob, for bonuses paid to Clyde Weller for services rendered. As he read, a deep, slow anger began to burn in his eyes. He looked up from the ledger, and for the first time, his gaze on Ephraim Pike was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. But the heart of the trial was not in the book. It was in the voices of the witnesses. Mercy was the first to take the stand. She was small in the large witness chair, but her voice was clear and steady. She told the court how she had seen the special padlock on the Army strongbox, and how she had later found that same lock in the scrap heap after overhearing Clyde Weller complain about scratching it. She spoke without fear, her gaze direct, her story unshakable. Then came the mother of the sickened child, a woman named Elena, speaking through an interpreter, her voice trembling but full of a mother's fierce anger. She told the story of the tainted whiskey Pike's men had sold in her camp, and how it had nearly taken the life of her young son. Her testimony put a human face on the soulless entries in Pike's ledger. It was no longer just a story of theft, but of lives endangered by a man's insatiable greed. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the testimony pressing down on everyone. Pike's lawyer blustered and objected, but the evidence was overwhelming, a tide of truth that could not be stopped. The final matter before the court was the legal status of Tahai and Evelyn. The kidnapping charge, based on Miriam's coerced statement, had been dismissed, but the nature of their relationship, that protection agreement signed under duress, remained a legal gray area. The judge looked down from his bench at Evelyn and Tahai, who sat together in the front row. Tahai's head was bandaged, and his arm was in a sling from an injury sustained in the flood, but he sat straight and proud. "Miss Hart," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you have been through a terrible ordeal. This court recognizes the courage you have shown. It also recognizes that you were placed in a vulnerable and untenable position. This territory has laws, but they are young, and sometimes they do not account for the harsh realities of life on the frontier." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There is, however, a long-standing precedent in territorial law for what is known as a customary marriage, an agreement between two parties, witnessed and consummated by their living together as man and wife. It is a provision meant to protect women in situations where formal ceremonies are impossible or impractical, given the document you both signed, and given the fact that you have since lived under this man's protection and have clearly, by your own testimony and actions, accepted this role. This court is prepared to recognize your union as a legal and binding customary marriage. This will grant you the full status and protection of a married woman under the law." He was turning Pike's weapon into their shield. He was giving them a legal foundation, a place to stand. The sound of the judge's gavel striking the wooden block was sharp and final. It was a small sound in the big room, but it was the sound of a door opening. It echoed with the fall of a corrupt man and the beginning of a new life. After the trial, the town remained a place of divided currents. The Panhandle Clarion printed a grudging, barely legible retraction on its back page. Jedediah and his followers still muttered in the saloon, but their anger was now impotent. Their leader exposed as a puppet. But something else had happened. The Black and Mexican families, who had always lived on the silent fringes of the town, had found a voice. They greeted Evelyn and Tahei on the street with nods of respect and gratitude. They had stood against a common poison, and in doing so, had forged the beginnings of a new kind of community. That afternoon, Miriam found Evelyn sitting on the steps of the now quiet supply post. Her aunt's face was pale, her eyes filled with a deep, weary shame. "Evelyn," she began, her voice a choked whisper. I am so sorry. For all of it, I was weak and a coward. I signed that paper because I was afraid. I never meant for it to cause such harm." Evelyn looked at the woman who had raised her, a woman she had both loved and resented. She saw not a monster, but a person broken by a world that was too hard for her. Forgiveness was not a simple thing, but understanding was a start. "I know, Miriam," Evelyn said quietly. "You were afraid. We all were." The apology could not erase the scars, but it was a balm on a raw wound. It was a closing of a painful chapter. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land, Tahei and Evelyn walked out of town. They followed the path of the now placid creek, its anger spent, its water running clear again. They stopped on a small rise overlooking a gentle bend in the water. It was a beautiful piece of land, dotted with a few sturdy mesquite trees and covered in thick, green grass, nourished by the flood. No fences marked this land. No one had yet driven a stake into its soil and called it their own. It was a place of possibility. Tahei stood beside her, his good arm resting lightly on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the light fade, listening to the gentle murmur of the water. "A man could build a house here," Tahei said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "A small house, with a porch to watch the sunset. It is good land." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. She looked at the open, unclaimed earth, at the clear water, at the man standing beside her. The red dust of her past was finally settling, and for the first time in her life, she felt the promise of a foundation beneath her feet. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was a builder, and this, she thought, was a very good place to start. They built the house themselves, on the small rise overlooking Rabbit Creek. Tahei, it turned out, knew as much about the language of wood as he did about the language of the plains. He chose the cottonwoods that had been felled by the recent flood, squaring the logs with a borrowed adze, his movements economical and precise. Evelyn worked beside him, learning to mix mud and grass for chinking. Her hands, once soft from measuring flour and beans, growing calloused and strong. They did not speak much as they worked. They did not need to. The rhythm of the saw, the thud of the hammer, the shared effort under the vast Texas sky was a conversation all its own. It was a small house, with just one room and a wide, covered porch that faced west, toward the sunset. It was solid and plain and beautiful. It was theirs. The first thing Tahei did when the walls were up was build the fence. But it was not a fence of barbed wire, that cruel invention that had sliced across the open range like a scar. He gathered saplings from the creek bed, young willows and cottonwoods, and planted them in a long, gentle curve around the small plot of land where Evelyn planned to have a garden. "A living fence," he had explained, pressing the earth firmly around the roots of a young tree. "It will not tear the flank of a stray horse or trap a calf. It will grow with the seasons. It offers a boundary, but it invites life to grow around it. It is a line of respect, not of ownership." Evelyn had looked from the tender green saplings to the memory of the glinting, vicious barbs of Pike's fences. She understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her bones, that this was the choice they were making every day to build a life that nurtured, rather than one that captured. Change came to the town, not in a great flood, but in a slow, steady trickle, like water finding a new path. One afternoon, the blacksmith, Mr. Gable, rode out to their small homestead, his face a mixture of embarrassment and desperation. His daughter-in-law had gone into a difficult labor, and the town's doctor was 2 counties away, tending to an outbreak of fever. He had come to ask for Nalene, who was visiting Tahay and Evelyn, her reputation as a healer having spread in quiet whispers. Nalene went without hesitation. She spent a long night in a small, stuffy room that smelled of fear and boiled linen, her calm presence and knowledge of herbs a steadying force against the young woman's panic. By dawn, she had delivered a healthy baby boy, her gentle, skilled hands succeeding where panic and ignorance had been failing. When she left, the blacksmith's wife pressed a warm loaf of bread and a jar of preserves into her hands, her eyes full of a gratitude that went deeper than words. A bridge had been crossed that night, built not of wood or stone, but of a shared, elemental human need. Mercy found her own new beginning at the heart of the town's forge, Mr. Gable. His gratitude to Tahay and Evelyn extending to the brave girl who had risked everything, took her on as his formal apprentice. He cleared a space for her by the quenching tubs, gave her a small hammer, and began to teach her the secrets of the fire. Evelyn would sometimes see her there, her face smudged with soot, her small arms surprisingly strong as she learned to heat and shape iron. The girl who had been an invisible orphan, sweeping dust in the shadows, was now a creator, hammering out a future for herself in sparks and sweat. She was no longer a piece of scrap on the heap. She was becoming the forge itself. One evening, Sheriff Hale rode out, carrying a letter. "It is from Corporal Caro," he said, handing it to Evelyn. "He has been reassigned to a fort up north. He asked me to give this to you." Later, on the porch, as the last light of day bled from the sky, Evelyn read the letter aloud to Tahay. Ben's handwriting was clear and strong, like the man himself. "Dear Evelyn and Tahay, I am writing this from my new post. The air is colder up here, and the land feels less alive. I find myself thinking often of the Panhandle, of the fire and the flood, and of the justice we found there. What happened in that town was a rare and difficult thing. It is easy for a man with a gun to enforce a bad law. It is much harder to stand up for a just one, especially when you are standing alone. I have come to believe that the frontier does not need more men who are quick to pull a trigger. It needs more people who are willing to build a fence of living trees. It needs sheriffs who will stand against a mob, and healers who will cross a divide to deliver a child, and young women who will teach a town to read, both from books and from the human heart. You are the future of this place. If it is to have a future worth living in, be well. My friends, your servant in justice, Corporal Ben Caro." They folded the letter and kept it in a small wooden box, a reminder of the allies they had found, and the kind of people they were striving to be. Their life took on a gentle, purposeful rhythm. In the mornings, Evelyn held a small school on her porch for any child who wanted to learn. Her students were a motley crew, 2 of the blacksmith's sons, several children from the Mexican settlement, and Mercy, whenever she could be spared from the forge. Evelyn taught them their letters, using charcoal on a piece of slate, her voice patient and kind. In the afternoons, Tahay taught them to ride, not with force, but with balance and respect for the animal. He showed them how to sit a horse so they became a part of its movement, how to guide it with a gentle pressure of the knees rather than a cruel tug of the bit. He was not just teaching them to be horsemen, he was teaching them a way of being in the world. One night, after a long, satisfying day, they sat together on the finished porch. A full, silver moon hung in the black, velvety sky, bathing the world in a soft, ethereal light. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of crickets and the soothing, constant murmur of the creek. Their work was done for the day. The children were asleep in their beds. The house was solid around them. A sense of profound, hard-earned peace settled over Evelyn, a feeling she had never known before. Tahei reached over and took her hand. His was warm and strong, the palm and fingers calloused from the axe and the plow and the reins. It was the hand of a warrior, a builder, a protector. Her hand rested in his, a perfect fit. She looked down at their joined hands in the moonlight. On her wrist, the deerskin band he had tied there so long ago was still in its place. It was softened with age and wear, the leather molded to the shape of her skin, as much a part of her now as a pulse. She remembered that other moment, in the red dust of the supply post yard, when he had first taken her hand. It had been the hand of a stranger, a captive, an object in a transaction. She had been a girl losing what little she thought she owned. She tightened her fingers around his, a willing, conscious choice. This was not the hand of a captive. It was the hand of a partner, a wife, a friend. It was a hand given freely, from a heart that was finally, truly, her own. She had been forced to take the first step on the trail, but every step since, she had walked by her own will. She had found her freedom not by running away, but by standing her ground and choosing her home. And she was home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help more people discover this tale.